What's up everyone? In today's video, I'll be sharing 8 unpopular card options for different Final Fantasy commanders. With the set release right around the corner, there is tons of excitement out there and some of the commanders already have over 3,000 or 4,000 decks built on Edhrec. For each commander, I scrolled through their Edhrec recommendations to make sure that none of the cards that I'm sharing today are listed for the commanders. And so if there was a card that I liked and it was shown as a card or a recommendation on EDHREC, then I took it off. So the entire goal of this is to give ideas that break away from that EDH reification of deck building. So let's jump right in, going from the most to least popular card today. The first on the list is a type that we've actually never really covered or talked about much before, and that is our first unpopular land, and that's Amanet Raceway, which is played in 21,934 decks. This is a land with start your engines, and it taps for colorless. At max speed, you can tap it to give a creature haste. The commander from Final Fantasy in question is Ultima Origin of Oblivion. Ultima is a 5-mana 4/4 legendary god that has flying and says, whenever Ultima attacks, put a blight counter on target land. For as long as that land has a blight counter on it, it loses all land types and abilities and has tap, add 1 colorless. Whenever you tap a land for colorless, add an additional colorless mana. So there's a few reasons why I think this is a great land option for Ultima. First of all, of course, it gives the colorless mana that the deck cares so much about in order to double it up. Second, Ultima's ability is an attack trigger, so the deck wants to give the commander haste to take advantage of the ability the turn it comes down. Other haste enablement in colorless is largely limited to the boots and maybe crashing drawbridge. But other than that, there's not a ton of stuff out there like there would be in red. So having it on a land, which is very unlikely to ever get removed, is super underrated. Yes, there is that aspect of needing to get to max speed. But I mean, have you seen the decks that people are brewing for this commander? If not, hint, it is all huge Eldrazi's because everyone's lands, or this commander makes their lands pretty much all tap for 2 mana, ancient tombs, so the goal of this deck is to turn creatures sideways and destroy your opponents with huge devastating effects. This deck wants to attack, and so the max speed thing shouldn't really be an issue getting in the way. Besides, once you do have max speed, you'll likely want to use the haste on your huge Eldrazi with Annihilator 4, or a cityscape leveler instead of just messing with someone's lands. Our second card today is Merchant of Truth, which sees play in 16,940 decks. This costs 2 generic and 2 white, is a 2/5 with flying, and says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, investigate. Clues you control have exalted. Merchant of Truth is one of those unpopular options for Squall Seed Mercenary. Squall is a 3/4 human knight mercenary for 4 mana, which says, so it has an ability called Rough Divide, and says, whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gains double strike until end of turn. Whenever Squall deals combat damage to a player, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So whether you're building this as a Voltron or a Reanimator or Aristocrats deck, this card's ability can be very relevant. Like with Voltron, you're likely building around Squall's exalted ability, so you want to be attacking with just 1 creature, so exalted stacks multiple times and can have a lot of buff triggers. You also need permanents to bring back from the graveyard, so non-token creatures are a very easy option to sacrifice and bring back again and again for this deck. Which is kind of interesting because unlike a lot of aristocrat decks, this commander has an incentive to sacrifice non-token creatures over token creatures, and Merchant is a great payoff for doing so. Your creatures will be dying, whether from your opponent's or your sacrifice effects. So Merchant of Truth can turn those into clue tokens for card draw, which also act, as that double anthem for your solo attacker with exalted triggers. This next card is actually one of my all-time favorite spells, and that's Spell Twine, which sees play in 13,720 decks. Spell Twine says, exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard. Copy those cards. Cast to the copies if able without paying their mana costs. Exile Spell Twine. The Final Fantasy commander I had in mind is Vivi Ornithir, who so far is the most popular commander from the main set with almost 5,000 decks, which is crazy this far ahead of release. Vivi is a 3-mana Izzet wizard that says, for 0, you can pay 0 and add X mana in any combinations of blue and or red, where X is Vivi Ornithir's power. Activate only during your turn and only once each turn. So it also has an ability that says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Vivi Ornithir and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Most people looking at the builds on Edhrec are building this commander with a ton of cantrips to activate the +1 counter and damage dealing ability as much times as possible in your turn. I do have a deck with a similar goal of casting as many spells as possible, and I switch up the commander depending on the day, and I have a ton of fun with it. It's either a Ral Monsoon Mage or a Zephi Thunder Conductor deck, but what I do is I kind of switch it up. Rather than casting a ton of cantrips, I love running cards that give multiple cast triggers from one single card, like Mnemonic Deluge, because you're copying the spells, yeah, but these cards in particular say you may cast the copies, so you get the cast triggers as well. I've actually won so many games by casting Spell Twine to get one cast trigger, then copying either a huge draw spell or something like an Aminatu's Augury or a Mana Geyser, and another great spell from an opponent's graveyard. I have also played this in my Emoti Celebrant of Bounty deck, and this can usually trigger 3 to 5 Cascade triggers for 6 mana with the spells you cast for free from graveyards. Like I said, it's a different approach for building this commander. Instead of focusing on small spells, you have some of the bigger ones that have multiple cast triggers per card, and I really enjoy it. If you haven't seen it on Edhrec, you can definitely give it a shot. Next up, we have Asinine Antics, which is played in 16,031 decks. Asinine Antics is a sorcery that costs 2 generic and 2 blue and says, you may cast the spell as though it had flash if you pay 2 more generic to cast it. For each creature your opponents control, create a cursed roll token attached to that creature. As a reminder, if you're not familiar with these roll tokens, it pretty much just turns the enchanted creature into a 1/1. This card goes with Sephiroth, Planet's Heir, who is a 4/4 human avatar soldier that costs 4 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black, has vigilance and says, when Sephiroth enters, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. And whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Sephiroth. I've played Asinine Antics several times, and each time, I've done it at instant or sorcery speed. It always catches people off guard and does so much work. I mean, so many decks these days are focused on winning through combat, and this can shut them down completely, or, at least kill a lot of their attackers. In this particular synergy, though, Asinine Antics turns Sephiroth into a one-sided board wipe and lets him stay on the battlefield to see all of the creatures dying and get a ton of +1/+1 counters. Being able to play this at instant speed also opens up the opportunity to save the mana and cast it at the end step before your turn begins, and then wipe the board by casting Sephiroth. The fact that both of them hit every creature your opponents control versus one opponent is super nice. I used to play this in an Essex Fractal Bloom deck that I made, and this card just is insane with Essex, because if there's 20 creatures between your opponents, you create their roll tokens, So instead, you can make 20 copies of literally any creature on the board instead. It was so much fun. Before we get to the next one, I'm going to run our monthly collector booster giveaway right now for patrons. If you're not familiar, the Patreon is just $2, but every month I will be running a collector booster giveaway to give to someone just as a thank you for being a part of the Patreon community. This month it's going to be a Ravnica remastered collector booster, and then next month it will be a Dominaria remastered, and I have quite a few others lined up. If you're interested, check out the Patreon, but otherwise, let's spin the wheel. Awesome. Huge congrats, Saint Absol, for winning the collector booster. Thanks so much for being a patron, and I'm excited to ship this out to you. Our next card is Count on Luck, which is played in 8,352 decks. Count on Luck is an enchantment that costs 3 red mana and says, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Simple. The commander that I had in mind that this doesn't appear for on Edhrec, but could synergize well with, is Clive, Ifrit's Dominant. Clive is a 6 mana that says when Clive enters, you may discard your hand. Then draw cards equal to your devotion to red. Then, for 4 generic and 2 red mana, you can tap to exile Clive, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, activate only as a sorcery, and the backside has just a bunch of strong shenanigans. So yeah, essentially, this is a strong inclusion, I think, due to adding 3 mana pip to the devotion to red. If nothing else is on the battlefield when you cast Clive, you at least draw 5 cards because Clive has 2 and Count on Luck has 3 red mana pips, in addition to the other card that you can cast this turn from Count on Luck. In addition to the ability and the 3 mana pips, I also think that it's just a very sturdy permanent that is more likely to stay on your battlefield longer than if it were a creature, because enchantments rarely die to board wipes, and this ability isn't a game ender, or it's not really hurting anyone either. It's kind of like a trickle card advantage each turn, but it doesn't break anyone. So it's much less likely to be the target of targeted removal compared to the other busted enchantments in the game. For that reason, I think this is a sneaky and good inclusion that will likely stay on the board until it's affected by like a farewell or another board wipe that happens to hit enchantments too. Up next is Path of Metal, which sees play in 3,082 decks. Path of Metal is a legendary enchantment that costs a red and a white and says, when Path of Metal enters, it deals 1 damage to each creature that doesn't have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, or Haste. Whenever you attack with at least 2 creatures that have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, and or Haste, transform Path of Metal. The transformed side is a legendary land called Metzali, Tower of Triumph. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. You can pay 1 generic and 1 red, and tap it to deal 2 damage to each opponent, or you can pay 2 generic, 1 white, and tap it to choose a creature at random that attacked this turn and destroy it. The commander I think that this could fit really well in is Lightning Army of 1. Lightning costs 1 generic and Boros colors, is a 3/2, and has First Strike, Trample, and Lifelink. There's an ability called Stagger that says, whenever lightning deals combat damage to a player, until your next turn, if a source would deal damage to that player, or a permanent that player controls, it deals double that damage instead. So there's a few reasons why I think a Path of Metal could be a great include. 1, lightning has First Strike and Haste, so your commander meets half the requirements to transform this into a land which would be a permanent ramp. Some popular creatures in Boros style decks, kind of like this, that could meet the other half include cards like Danitha Capuchin Paragon, who reduces the cost of equipping. There's Edhrec Lunarch Marshal to give your keyword soup on your commander to everyone else. There's Kellen the Fayblooded as a tutor for some of those enchantments or the equipment. Aurelia the Law Above for attacking benefits, or even Baird Steward of Argive to prevent attackers after you swing. Number 2. 1 damage, isn't a ton, but it does kill a lot of the value engines in the games, like Esper Sentinel. There's Birds of Paradise / pretty much most other mana dorks out there. There's Blood Artist, Orcus Bowmasters, Scoot Swarm, Lotus Cobra, and so many others. 3. When this does transform, that pretty much becomes a permanent ramp for 2 mana in Boros. The abilities also are relevant to Lightning. Lightning doubles up damage dealt to the opponent that she hit, so 2 and tapping would deal 4 damage to one opponent and 2 to the others. And also that destroy ability is pretty nice. It gets past Hexproof and Shroud because it doesn't target, and the rules state that it can be activated before blockers. So if people are swinging at you, they got to be careful because one of their big attackers could die before they even get a chance to attack or to deal damage. I think these flip lands in general are just super underrated. I'm curious to hear what people think of them and if you have any other favorites. All right, 2 more. This next one is Simila Melodician Poet. Anyone know what the correct pronunciation is? I almost said Simia, but yeah, it played in 2,359 decks. We don't really cover legendary creatures often in these lists, but Simila is a 1/1 human bard that costs 2 generic and 1 white and says, whenever you cast your first enchantment spell each turn, create a 2/2 white nymph enchantment creature token. At the beginning of each combat, if you control 5 or more enchantments, Simila gets +4/+4 and gains lifelink until end of turn. The final fantasy commander in question that this could work with is Yuna, Hope of Spira. Yuna's ability says, during your turn, Yuna and enchantment creatures you control have trample, lifelink, and ward 2. At the beginning of your end step, return up to 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. This one will be pretty brief because the synergy is straightforward. This commander will likely be running a lot of Enchantress and Constellation effects, so Simila is great for doubling up on those effects. Whenever you cast 1 enchantment or your first enchantment each turn, you'll also create a 2/2 enchantment creature token to get a second Constellation effect, which many times is drawing a card. Not only does this create an extra body and an enchantment when you cast an enchantment, they meet the requirement of being an enchantment creature token as well. With anthems or big buffs on the board, Yuna could have huge turns of overwhelming opponents and gaining a bunch of life too. Lastly, even though Simila isn't an enchantment creature, it could play well into a life game strategy with Yuna because it will quickly become a 5/5 with lifelink because 5 enchantments on board is honestly a very small requirement for Enchantress decks. Our last card today is dropping all the way down to 612 decks with Inner Sanctum. Inner Sanctum is an enchantment that costs 1 generic and 2 white and says cumulative upkeep, pay 2 life. And then its ability says prevent all damage that would be dealt to creatures you control. If you're not familiar with cumulative upkeep, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent. Then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. And so that's something that when I first saw these abilities, I didn't realize like the cumulative aspect. I was like, awesome. 2 each turn, that's like nothing. But no, with cumulative upkeeps, it's every turn it stacks. So turn 1 would be 2 life, then 4 life, 6, 8, 10, etc. The reason why I'm bringing up this card is because it is a very unpopular inclusion for Hope S-Time. Hope is a 2-mana 2/2 wizard with lifelink that says at the beginning of your end step, each opponent mills X cards, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. This deck is running all the huge life gain effects that you can run in white and blue, and it wants to mill out its opponents. And speaking of huge life gain, One of my favorite white cards that I put in most white decks as like a lifesaver is Congregate. I win most games that I cast it because out of nowhere it can give me 50 plus life gain. And this was the first thing that came to mind when I saw this commander because it's only in 13,000 decks, but it's already listed as a card for this commander on Edhrec, so I kind of cut it. But anyways, I like Inner Sanctum because you're going to have a ton of life, and sometimes you might not know what to do with all that. Black is very popular for using life as a resource, but white doesn't really have many abilities to turn that huge life total into a resource. So, let's say you play this on turn 5. When things are starting to heat up, on turn 6, that's only 2 life. Then by the time it's turn 10, yeah, that would be 10 life. But you'd likely have so much more life by that point. And barring, huge trample threats, this can turn your tokens into a huge wall of blockers to make it very difficult to chip away at your life total because they can't get past the chump blockers and they survive every turn. And so unless someone does have those tramples, then it's pretty hard to get you down. This is also great if you have like a red player in your group that is always casting things like Blasphemous Act or any other red board wipe that deals damage to the board. Once again, it's only in 612 decks, but I think the life gain this deck is planning can greatly outpace the cumulative upkeep cost of keeping this enchantment on the board to protect your creatures from combat and non-combat damage. Well, this is the first time I've done unpopular cards aligned with a set release. I'd love to hear what you think as I try new things. And let me know in the comments below what topic you'd like me to post about next. In full transparency, I'm working on a lands video, which I pinned in the last video. So if you do get that pin, then it will become a video posted on this channel. So thanks everyone for, participating. I love hearing your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.